Out of context, at the impeachment trial, Chuck Schumer can't get anyone to read his erotic screenplay.
I ask that it be read. It's short.
We learn how John Bolton got Rudy Giuliani on the no-fly list.
He warned that President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, would, quote, blow everybody up.
And new guidelines say you should have 5 serves of vegetables a day.
President Trump did not receive the recommendation well.
This has been the impeachment trial of Donald Trump.
We want to thank you for your patience.
Whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Hello and welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chancellor Gidello.
This week, the Bolton bombshell.
Bombshell.
Bombshell. Bombshell.
Bombshell.
Has the former Trump advisor blown the president's impeachment defense right out the window?
The countdown is on to next week's Iowa caucuses. We'll talk to former presidential candidate Howard Dean.
And we'll look at why rural Iowa gets such a big say in who's going to be president.
But first, break it down.
Pressure is mounting on Senate Republicans to allow witnesses to appear before the president's impeachment trial, a move that looked unlikely until the leak of a book manuscript written by Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. President Trump's defence wrapped up earlier today. It consisted of 6 key points. Here's the first from Deputy White House Counsel Michael Papura.
The transcript shows that the president did not condition either security assistance or a meeting on anything.
Trump didn't tell the Ukrainian President Zelensky he was withholding security assistance. That's true enough, although there was just a partial transcript released, of course, not verbatim. We don't know what else could have been in there but left out. The second point for the defence?
President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have repeatedly said that there was no quid pro quo and no pressure on them to review anything.
And that is certainly what Zelensky himself said last September.
We had I think, good phone call. It was normal. We spoke about many things, and so I think, and you read it, that nobody pushed it.
Now, the timeline of who knew the $391 million in military aid was being withheld is still kind of murky. The aid was released when that whistleblower complained to members of Congress, by which time Zelensky had scheduled a CNN interview to announce an investigation into Burisma and Biden. Then came the third defence point.
President Zelensky and high-ranking Ukrainian officials did not even know. The security assistance was paused until the end of August, over a month after the July 25 call.
That end of August claim has been contradicted by witnesses, including America's top diplomat in Ukraine, Bill Taylor, and the New York Times, which reported word of the aid freeze had gotten to high-level Ukrainian officials by the first week in August, Chaz.
Yeah, Trump's defence did address that, though. I'll talk more about that on Friday's show. But on to defence number 4.
Not a single witness testified that the president himself said that there was any connection between any investigations and security assistance, a presidential meeting, or anything else.
And that is true. No witnesses directly saw Trump tying military aid to investigations. Well, at least that was true until yesterday, when that defence was squashed by a giant novelty moustache. On to defence number 5.
The security assistance flowed on September 11, and a presidential meeting took place on September 25, without the Ukrainian government announcing any investigations.
Now, of course, the Ukrainian president still hasn't gotten his White House meeting, just a side meeting at the UN, which he didn't seem exactly thrilled by. And yes, the military aid was eventually released, but after the whole thing became public. Would Trump have released the aid anyway? Trump says he would have, but do the Senate believe him? Finally, defense number 6.
President Trump has been a better friend and stronger supporter of Ukraine than his predecessor.
And it's true that Trump and Congress have agreed to give Ukraine much more military aid assistance than Obama did. But we shouldn't get carried away with that. Even those much vaunted anti-tank Javelin missiles were only sold to Ukraine on the condition they'd be stored in western Ukraine, hundreds of miles from the battlefield. And of course, all because Trump was generally good to Ukraine doesn't mean he wasn't capable of exploiting them for his personal gain on that one occasion.
Let's just rewind things to that giant novelty moustache guy, though. That fourth point, that is where John Bolton's book has proved to be particularly awkward.
The former national security advisor reportedly claiming the president explicitly linked military aid to Ukraine to investigations into his political rivals like the Bidens.
So, in the book, Bolton says the president made it very clear to him in August last year that aid would be withheld until the Ukrainians helped with investigations into Democrats, including the Bidens. Quid pro quo. Here's Democrat Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
This is stunning. It goes right to the heart of the charges against the president.
Or there's Republican Congressman Jim Jordan.
Someone telling the New York Times that they think the draft manuscript of John Bolton's book says something, that doesn't change anything.
So it's stunning or just more hearsay, not worth getting Bolton to testify, all depending on who you ask right now. But of course, it's not up to Jim Jordan or Chuck Schumer. It is up to Senate Republicans like Mitt Romney.
I think it's increasingly likely that other Republicans will join those of us who think we should hear from John Bolton.
Yeah, I can see why Republicans would be nervous about this one, because it could get worse. According to Axios, Bolton was a voracious note-taker in every meeting. And according to some anonymous White House officials, Bolton took notes from the White House that he should have left behind. So who knows where that's all going. Now, it is true that we still don't know if these news reports are an accurate indication of what's in the book, but given that Bolton's lawyer said the White House book review process has been corrupted and that information has been disclosed by people other than those properly involved, it does imply that the book has been described accurately.
President Trump, though, denies telling Bolton aid to Ukraine was linked to a Biden probe. But one of the president's counsel's constitutional lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, told senators that even if the president did everything that's being alleged in the Bolton book, it wouldn't matter.
If a president, any president, were to have done what the Times reported about the content of the Bolton manuscript, that would not constitute an impeachable offense.
Yeah, although Dershowitz also said in his recent book that if we imagine Putin retaking Alaska and the president letting him do that, then that would also not constitute an impeachable abuse of power. So that is an interesting theory he's got there. But you know, we've said this before. None of those defences that we just mentioned are Trump's real defence. Obama ex-campaign manager David Axelrod talked about a focus group he went to where they showcased Trump's real defence.
Impeachment didn't even come up. No one volunteered it for 80 minutes into the focus group. And, you know, we're right in the middle of the trial. When it came up, they said, you know, it's terrible what he did. The case has been proven, but we know how it's going to turn out. So we're not really that interested. We're ready to move on.
Move on, this is going nowhere defence. Now that defence is probably going to work.
We will soon see, because we now have 2 days of questions from both sides to counsel. Then comes the vote on whether witnesses like Bolton will appear. Right now, though, Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell says he does not have the votes to block witnesses appearing.
Yeah, unfortunately though, the trial coverage has been kind of ordinary because Mitch McConnell has been controlling the cameras. So all the shots have been placed under very strict guidelines. No reaction shots, no senators. However, that has led to the return of the newspaper sketch artist.
And now for questions raised by impeachment trial sketch artists. Why is Marco Rubio writing with a quill? Why is Richard Burr not wearing any socks? And who exactly brought the spittoon? Shall we go in for a sketch close-up? There. These were questions raised by impeachment trial sketch artists.
Governor Howard Dean on the 2020 race is coming up on Planet America.
But first, the latest impeachment polls see 47 to 51% of people supporting removal of the president. Exactly the same results as 4 months ago. And Trump's polling does tend to be sticky like that. His approval amongst Republicans, for instance, is anchored at around 90%. And his approval amongst Democrats is anchored at around 10%, registering an 82-point gap in approval last year, which is a record for partisanship. Well done all! And that broke the previous partisanship record set all the way back in 2018. In fact, if we go down the list, the entire top 10 years for partisanship in Gallup's 75-year polling history occurred in the last 16 years. And it's not just the polls where this is happening, it's in Congress too. This chart shows the ideology of Republicans and Democrats, where a high score means conservative. Congress is currently more polarised than it has ever been in history, and the polarisation isn't slowing down. In fact, partisanship is now spreading to define people right across the board. Back in 1994, if you measured 10 key political values, there was about a 10 to 15 point gap there in those values between people of different genders, age, their education, their party. But look what's happened since then. Your party is overwhelming all the other factors that define your views on just about everything. So why is this happening? Well, obviously like-minded people are clustering together more these days, both geographically and online, and also with their information sources as well. So these groupings are constantly being reinforced. But there's another factor as well. These are the presidential election vote margins, and we're currently in the middle of a 5-election stretch, as you can see, the closest elections since the 1880s, and everyone expects this year's election to be just as close as well. Tense, hey? But at the same time, this is the percentage of states that have elected the same party for the last 5 elections. We're up to about 75% of states now that are complete no contest, and this is the first time ever that's happened. And I mean no contest, by the way. This is the difference between the national vote margin and the state vote margin in those presidential elections. While the national votes have been very close, on a state level, those national elections have been massive blowouts. So, putting that all together, you've got close elections at a national level that people get all worked up about. But for most people, their vote in those elections at the state level are meaningless. That is a recipe for frustration, escalation, and lashing out. And that all gets supercharged by the form that this partisanship is taking. It's called negative partisanship. It's when you hate the other side more than you love your own. For example, in 1994, 21% of Republicans had a very unfavourable view of Democrats, and 17% of Democrats had a very unfavourable view of Republicans. But by 2016, those numbers had risen to 58% and 55%. And to put those numbers in context, last year, this many Republicans and that many Democrats had very unfavourable views of Iran. By mid-2018, 65% of Democrats describe Republicans as a somewhat or very serious threat to America and its people. And 62% of Republicans said the same thing about Democrats. By last year, 44% of Democrats and 55% of Republicans were saying that the other party was not just worse for politics, they are downright evil. And 27% of Democrats and 34% of Republicans were saying that the people in the other party lack the traits to be considered fully human. They behave like animals. Okay, now that's just kind of becoming funny now, but here is the problem. A rather ironically named More in Common poll last year found that 16% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats sometimes thought they'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died. And 14% of Republicans and 18% of Democrats felt that some violence could be justified in response to the other side winning the 2020 election. Now that is where this becomes a big problem.
I disagree, you evil subhuman animalistic threat!
I've got to say, he hates with real gravitas.
Big, beautiful world.
We're just a few days away now from the start of the process to choose the Democratic presidential nominee, the Iowa caucuses. We'll find out why Iowa has its unique role in just a moment. But first, to the latest polls. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is leading in 3 of 4 Iowa polls this week. But there is something to hearten the top 5 candidates. In a YouGov poll, Bernie is 1 point ahead of Biden, with Buttigieg also above 20%. And Siena has Bernie 7 points clear of Buttigieg, with Biden in third. Biden, though, has a 6-point lead in a Suffolk poll this week, with Bernie just ahead of Pete in third. Emerson gave Bernie a big 9-point margin over Biden, with Amy Klobuchar surging into third place. On average, Sanders is 3 points clear of Biden, then Buttigieg, Warren and Klobuchar.
Interestingly, Sanders' support seems to have surged at exactly the same time as Warren's has receded, which makes me think there might be a connection there. It's possible that Warren accusing Sanders of doubting that a woman can beat Trump not only backfired, but also activated gender as a real issue in his campaign. I mean, look at this CBS poll from last week. 54% of Iowa Democrats say it will be harder to beat Trump with a female nominee. And this poll from late last year tells a story as well. 71% of Democrats said they were ready for a female president, but only 57% said that America was ready for a female president, and only 31% said their neighbours were ready for a female president, sounding like some barely hidden bias to me. And here's another sign. In CNN's poll last week, 9% of men said that a woman couldn't win the presidency, but 20% of women said a woman can't win the presidency. And I don't think those are self-hating women. I just think they might be a little bit more conscious of the challenges that a female candidate faces. And a couple more notes from that Siena poll of yours, John. Biden is receiving about 55% of Klobuchar supporters' second preferences. So given that in Iowa, if you don't attract 15% of the support in the room, your supporters get divvied up according to their second pick, that could prove to be a big bonus for Joe Biden. And finally, I think I know why those Iowa polls were all over the place.
Yeah.
Amongst those people deemed almost certain to caucus next week, Sanders was beating Biden by 11. But amongst those not very or not at all likely to caucus, Biden was leading Sanders by 39. So once again, the predicted result depends on how you define likely voter. It makes polling a real nightmare.
Yeah, it certainly does. And as we'll see, Iowa isn't just about winning, it is about exceeding expectations. And right now, the expectation is that Bernie is going to win. But if Biden wins, that'll change the story. The establishment moderates are reasserting themselves. If Pete wins, then suddenly he's the new Obama. Buttigieg will be the young, gay candidate of change. If Elizabeth Warren's ground game gets her into first or even second place, she'll be the comeback kid. And she did get a boost this week with the endorsement of Iowa's Des Moines Register, describing her as the best leader for these times.
Yeah, and Warren reacted to that endorsement in the most Warrenish possible way, by jumping around awkwardly.
Well, meanwhile, Amy Klobuchar has been focusing on more conservative northern areas of Iowa. That's up near the border of her home state of Minnesota. And if she somehow manages to make it into the top 3, as she did in one of those polls, maybe she'll replace Biden as the pick of the moderates. So the bottom line is this Iowa vote next week is going to do a lot to define the entire nominating contest. A few hundred votes here or there in a particular precinct can make a big difference. And it's all happening, of course, while Sanders, Warren, Klobuchar and Michael Bennet are stuck in the Senate trial 6 days a week, while Biden and Pete are crisscrossing the state in their campaign buses. But Mike Bloomberg may have skipped Iowa, but take a look at this. Here he is campaigning in Vermont this week. He shakes a man's hand and then he shakes a dog's mouth. Mike Bloomberg has some work to do on his campaigning technique.
How does that work?
Now, next Monday night, Democrats in rural Midwestern Iowa will leave their farms, their homes, their workplaces, and they will take part in the presidential caucuses. And this state has quite the reputation for making and breaking White House contenders. This is Iowa. Over 3 million people, more than 90% of them white, lots of farms, pigs, corn, soybeans, and right now, over a dozen presidential candidates.
Hello, Iowa. Here in Iowa.
Iowa caucuses are up to you.
But why Iowa? Leading up to the 1972 election, the Democratic Party decided they wanted to make their party more democratic, electing their presidential candidate rather than letting party bosses pick them. So candidates would now have to stand in state primaries and caucuses. A primary is a secret ballot, a lot like we have here. A caucus, though, is a meeting in a school gym or town hall where you vote with a show of hands or move to a corner with other supporters of a particular candidate. It can take hours and it is all public.
It's Iowa caucus night! Let's party!
Iowa has a caucus, and in 1972 they passed a law so they would be the first state to hold a vote. And ever since then, Iowa has had an outsized influence on who goes on to be president. It's not as simple as win Iowa and you win the nomination, although sometimes it is. Barack Obama's victory in Iowa in 2008 proved he could appeal to white voters.
We shall overcome. Yes, we can.
Iowa sometimes just knocks front-runners off their perch, like Ed Muskie in 1972, who won, but not by as much as expected, or Howard Dean in 2004, who was leading in the polls but then came third and then did this. And Iowa is one of the few places where you'll see presidential candidates turning up at house parties, diners and coffee shops, and the Iowa State Fair with its 69 items of fried food on a stick.
Pretty good.
And yes, Iowans will judge you if you can't grill a pork chop. In a way, Iowa is an old-fashioned, all-American film set for candidates to appear on TV screens around the country. It's also a proving ground that gives voters and reporters more access than anywhere else. I mean, you can basically just walk up to a candidate and ask questions. It is so cool.
Whoever wins Iowa, New Hampshire, these early states, is the person who's going to be the nominee.
The Iowa caucuses involve votes in almost 2,000 precincts across the state, and getting people to turn up on a Monday night in the middle of winter takes a lot of organisation and thousands of volunteers who call and door knock for months. Money helps, but your ground game and the enthusiasm you can generate counts most of all. For all of that, turnout in Iowa is pretty low. In 2016, 171,000 Democrats and 186,000 Republicans voted in the caucuses. A candidate needs at least 15% in a precinct to be viable and win any delegates. But if your candidate isn't viable, you get a second choice. The saying goes, there are 3 tickets out of Iowa. Candidates who come fourth or worse often drop out. Critics point out Iowa is not demographically representative of America. Its defenders say Iowa is balanced by New Hampshire, Nevada and South Carolina, who also vote in February. And after all, Iowans did vote for this guy and not this guy.
My name is Vermin Scream. I'm a friendly fascist. I'm a tyrant that you can trust.
Ultimately, Iowa is important because after all of the hype, all of the polls, all of the handshakes and all of the rallies, it is the first time people actually vote for a president. Well, joining us from New York is none other than former Democratic presidential candidate and chairman of the Democratic Party, Howard Dean. Governor, welcome back to Planet America.
Great to be back.
So tell us, based on your experience, what are the best and worst things about running for president in Iowa?
Well, actually, Iowa was just fun to campaign in. The worst thing was, of course, was the National Press Corps, which is always awful. They consider that to be their job. But Iowa's a delight. The people are great. They're plain spoken, and you eat lots of incredibly caloric food at all the county fairs, and it's fun. And they're well educated. It's one of the highest education levels in the country.
Of course, Governor, the major criticism of Iowa, though, is that, yes, they're super informed, they're highly educated, but they're also super white and a largely rural state as well.
Being a rural state is not a problem. The Democrats need to learn to do better in rural states. But their demographics don't look anything like the demographics of the Democratic Party, nor of the country, for that matter. The other problem is the caucus system is incredibly undemocratic. A tiny fraction get to vote. If you're elderly and can't get out, you don't get to vote. If you have 2 small children at home and you can't leave them, you don't get to vote. If you work 2 jobs, you don't get to vote. So it is a very undemocratic system, and it really has to be fixed soon.
Governor, on the caucus system, there's every chance that in Iowa, the person who wins the most votes will not win the most delegates. And in the case of the 2012 Republicans, the people who won the most delegates didn't even send the most delegates to the convention. Isn't it time to scrap the entire caucus system completely?
It might be. It is a complicated system, and I do think it needs to be fixed. When I was chairman, I did add Nevada and South Carolina to the early states. Instead of 2, which are predominantly white, like over 90%, we now have a state with a second highest percentage of Asian Americans, a very high percentage of Latinos, and another state where 60% of the voters on the Democratic side will be African American. So we have fixed the problem some, but it needs more work. The other problem is that New Hampshire is particularly bad because it was controlled by the Republicans and they put it in a bill to restrict college students from voting. Well, college students happen to be one of our most important constituencies. So there are some substantial problems in the nominating process. There's no question about that.
2020, of course, is the first time since you ran in 2004 that Democrats are trying to take on an incumbent Republican president. Are there any lessons you think that can be drawn from that experience this time around?
I'm not sure there are particular lessons from that year, but the lesson in general is, which most people don't understand. People think we all vote on issues and we all flatter ourselves to think that we think about the issues. Nobody votes on issues, including very well-educated people who care deeply about issues. Issues are a proxy for our emotions, and that doesn't matter if you're a working-class guy who barely got out of high school or if you're an incredibly well-educated people. The educated people will try to pretend they vote on issues. They don't. Issues are a substitute for their emotions. You have to be able to connect with people. I know George Bush. I served with him when he was governor of Texas. I was governor of Vermont. And I'll tell you, he is a great politician. He never got credit for that because he followed one of the great politicians, probably the greatest since Franklin Roosevelt in terms of Clinton's ability. But connecting with human beings is what gets you the presidency. The core question in any poll that you ask is, does this person care about people like me? And if the answer to that is no, you've got a big problem. And that's what Trump's problem is going to be. There are people who like Trump. The economy's good. He's punching people in the mouth that they haven't liked for a long time and appealing to the worst instincts in people. The truth is, they know damn well he doesn't care about people like them. And that's going to be the hindrance. But it means that we have to elect people who do believe, the public is going to believe, cares about that person. And if we do that, we're going to beat Trump.
And we will have plenty more for you from Howard Dean on Friday night's Fireside Chat.
I love titrations, yeah, that's not a problem. And I got new patients and I got a lot of them. I love titrations, yeah, that's not a problem. And I got new patients and I got a lot of them. I love titrations, yeah, that's not a problem. And I got new patients and I got a lot of them. If you want to be great, listen to my voice. You can be great, but it's your choice. I love titrations, yeah, that's not a problem. And I got new patients and I got a lot of them. Titrations, yeah, that's not a problem. I got new patients and I got a lot of them. If you want to be great, listen to my voice. You can be great, but it's your choice.
In the past 100 years, only 4 presidents who sought another term lost: Hoover, Ford, Carter and Bush. And what did they have in common? A lousy economy. Hoover was running at the height of the Great Depression with unemployment at close to 25%. Gerry Ford had to manage stagnant economic growth, high unemployment and inflation, or stagflation. Jimmy Carter's problems included a 13% inflation rate, and George Bush won the Gulf War, but a recession saw unemployment peak at 7.8%. Every other president who stood for another term has won it. Like Bill Clinton's campaign manager James Carville famously said,
"It's the economy, stupid."
We hear a lot about gun deaths in America, but gun deaths means different things depending on whether you're black or white. You see, there are 2 kinds of gun deaths. There's gun deaths by homicide and gun deaths by suicide. And the rate of death by gun homicide for black men is about 14 times as high as it is for white men, whereas the rate of death by gun suicide for black men is only about 1/3 as high as it is for white men. Now, there's a few things you'll notice here. Firstly, I'm emphasising men because when it comes to homicide, well, women...
Because we don't shoot people.
Well, let's just say their gun death rates are a lot lower. Secondly, Hispanic men have a slightly higher death by homicide rate than white men and a slightly lower death by suicide rate than black men, but it's hard to get good stats on them. The bottom line, though, is that 84% of the gun deaths suffered by black men are homicides, whereas 87% of the gun deaths suffered by white men are suicides. And that might explain the different attitudes white and black people often have towards guns. Yeah, not those guns. Which leads us to this week's Best and Worst segment. The state with the lowest gun homicide rate for black men is Rhode Island, where 9.5 per 100,000 black men die from gun homicide every year. That's a little more than twice the national average. Whereas the state with the highest gun homicide rate is Missouri, where 59 per 100,000 black men die from gun homicide every year. And that's largely because St. Louis, Missouri is the murder capital of America. Yeah, it's not like that anymore. If black men in Missouri were a country, they would have literally the highest gun homicide rate on earth, marginally ahead of the gun violence death rate in Venezuela.
And Chaz, that is it for another trip to Planet America. We will have an update for you on Friday night, 8 o'clock Eastern Time on the ABC News channel with a fireside chat.
And you'll find both shows on iView, YouTube and Facebook.
Bye-bye.